Hello, folks. So my goal in this overview video is to try, and I guess the emphasis there is on try, to give you a very brief introduction to Shakespeare. Notice I said very brief because, my gosh, so much has been written about Shakespeare. Since he lived 400 years ago, there's been a lot of time to sort of talk about him, and he is literally the most famous author in the world. So thousands of books have been written about this. Folks have devoted their whole lives to studying him. We're obviously not going to cover all of that in the course of this video. I'm going to try to keep it short so as to not lose your attention. Hence my, taming of the spear, taming of the Shakespeare, referencing the title of the work that we're going to be reading here. So I'm going to keep it trim, try to hit some of the things that I hope will be useful to you as we start to move into this study of Shakespeare. Pause. Okay, and I'm back. Sorry, had to move the cat. Okay, so very brief introduction to Shakespeare. This, by the way, is also the third time that I'm trying this video because the audio didn't work the first two times, so it may not be as smooth as the first two. Anywho, onward. Okay, this is the question that you are probably asking. Why are we even reading Shakespeare? So that is a great question. I think this is definitely not an optimal time to be doing it. In the best situation, we would be reading this together. That's what I was hoping for, because I think it makes so much more sense that way. We can act this out and see it and hear it and talk through it. But I mean, we will do the best that we can with this. I think we're gonna be able to pull this off. But I guess that question is like, why do all these people still study this guy 400 years later? Why is he the most famous author in the world, not just in England and the United States? I want to start to sort of move through that so you have a sense. I guess at the most basic level, there's the fact that you guys are going to encounter this again in high school and sort of college, but it's more than that. There's something going on here that I really want you to be able to see. So I want to just take just a quick moment to peruse the screen here and sort of in thinking about this. I think you are going to recognize, I'm going to see if I can move my mouse across some of these. The screen is kind of split here between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And so on this left-hand side, these are all texts, actually, films that have come out sometime in the last 50, 60 years that have been based on Shakespeare's works, very famous works. So in the upper left-hand corner, Throne of Blood by Akira Kurosawa, a Japanese director you may or may not know. Forbidden Planet, a science fiction movie based on The Tempest. So Throne of Blood was based on Macbeth. 10 Things I Hate About You, which we're going to be watching some clips from, actually starting this week, is based on Taming of the Shrew. There's also a musical version of this called Kiss Me Kate that was on Broadway. And speaking of Broadway, below that, West Side Story, which is based on Romeo and Juliet. There was a really cool version of Romeo and Juliet that came out, film version, adaptation, Leonardo DiCaprio in the 90s. And then I left for the middle there, The Lion King, which is riffing on Hamlet in some ways. And so I guess I want you guys to see, in terms of Shakespeare's influence, so much of the work that appears in pop culture is beholden to him, right? These works, as I said, some of these movies started in the 50s and 60s. For generations, folks have been referencing his work. So part of the reason that I want you to know his work is to see the way that other folks around you are using this. On the right-hand side of the screen, these aren't works that are based on Shakespeare per se, but they allude, if you remember that term, allusion with an A reference to another work. In their titles, they're making reference to his works, so quotes from his works. Brave New World, some of you guys will read that as juniors and seniors. Our Boy Ray Bradbury in the middle, Something Wicked This Way Comes. Band of Brothers, which was both a book and then a TV show on HBO. The Fault in Our Stars, which many of you may know, and The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, one of my favorite authors. Really famous novels from throughout works. These were all books first. Some of them were made into movies throughout the 20th century that are calling out in some way their connection to Shakespeare. They don't directly, they're not direct adaptations, but they're referencing his work in some way. So part of the reason that I want you to understand or to be familiar with Shakespeare is because he gets referenced so often in popular culture. And again, this is just a quick start on that. Okay, so the number that I put up on the screen here, 10%. So this hopefully is not my score on a quiz on Shakespeare or something like that. But instead, this is the number of quoted lines in English that are attributed to Shakespeare. So in other words, when we think of phrases that are most commonly used or sort of references made, 10% of those and all things that are written in English come from Shakespeare. So that's in some ways how famous he is. There's a famous thing in a book called The Westing Games, and that is very much true, that if you're not sure where a quote comes from, like you're reading something like, oh, this is a famous quote, it's probably from one of two places: the Bible, which is the #1 most quoted work in Western culture, or Shakespeare, which is #2. So 10% of the things that are sort of quoted or phrases oftentimes attributed to him. So I wanted you guys to kind of to see, again, part of this is not just understanding his works, but his influence in his language, which is my next slide here. Okay, so I've got to point out to you guys, this is controversial. You're going to read stuff online and on the web, and people are like, oh, Shakespeare contributed 3,000 words to the English language, and he knew 30,000 words, and that that's an idea. We hold Shakespeare as this godlike figure, and he did sort of extraordinary work, but those numbers are oftentimes a little bit off. And even these words that I have on the screen here, it seems more likely from what we know now, not necessarily that Shakespeare invented and added all these words to our language, 2,000 or 3,000 words, but instead he's the one who made them famous. Because his works are so famous, we're familiar with these words now, or we saw them used for the first time in his works. Now, that being said, he was a master of using words. So sometimes he was shifting. He was turning adjectives into nouns, into verbs, and he was playing with language in ways that folks really hadn't been doing. So he was incredibly skillful at doing this. But to say that these words he invented entirely, that's difficult to say, and I'm going to leave that to Shakespeare scholars. But I just wanted to put out that in some ways he's known, or he made these phrases famous: heart of gold, break the ice, fair play, good riddance, love is blind, and some of the words bedazzled, which actually shows up in the play that we're going to read. And it's not about like putting shiny stuff on your jeans. Puking, hey, I wish I had contributed that word to the English language. Cheap, fashionable. Anyhow, so part of what he's famous for is his words, right? And what he was able to do with those words and how he made them memorable. These are reasons why I want you to be reading Shakespeare and why so many folks ask that. Okay, so just a really quick intro on the man himself, William Shakespeare. Let's take a look just in case you weren't clear. Yeah, there he is over there. For those of you who took a picture of me last week during office hours and ran my face through the bald cap, app thingamabobber, I kind of look like that. And unfortunately, my mustache is sort of like turning up on the sides like his. Not like I really want that to happen. Because I have that sweet like hoop earring going on there. I may need to get one of those. Yeah, but he's also kind of got like the bald mullet. So I don't want to get down on his look. He does have that super fly collar. But anyhow, this is William Shakespeare, and on the right-hand side of my screen here, this is Stratford-on-Avon. This is William Shakespeare's home. So this is the town that he was born in, Stratford-on-Avon. I want you to keep that in mind. You're going to see that come up when we watch some movie clips later on in the week. So the thing about William Shakespeare is he was not born into a wealthy family, right? This isn't what sort of made him famous. Instead, he's born to a tradesman in this smaller town, almost kind of suburbs or sort of rural town outside of London. He is not university educated, but the fact that his father is a tradesman, and you're going to watch another video on this, he is able to get a good, solid education, but more sort of almost what we think of as a sort of a middle school or high school education. He's married and with children very young. By the age of 18, he has, I think, 3 children, or at least in his teens. And so William Shakespeare sets off to make a name for himself, to make his fortune by going to London, by going to the big city. And so this is where he finds his success. And so when Shakespeare gets to London, the thing about it is this is 1593, and our relevance here, the Black Plague is sweeping through. 5% of the population in London is killed by the Black Plague in 1593. This means the theaters are closed, and that's what Shakespeare has done. He's come here to work in the theaters, to be a writer, and to be an actor. But the theaters are closed, so he starts writing poetry. And he actually makes a name for himself writing poetry first. But it's really in the theater, when they reopen, that's where he finds success. And the thing about Shakespeare that's so extraordinary is he's this self-made man. It's kind of this rags to riches story. He not only he becomes famous enough as a playwright that other people are kind of in town start writing these like diss tracks about him because they're like, where'd that guy come from? He's got no university education. He thinks he's so smart. So you can kind of tell that he made it big because other folks are trying to pull him down. But he's also becoming famous enough that he attracts the attention of King James. So the king at the time recognizes the talent of him. He's able to build his own theater called the Globe. He invests in property. And so as an actor and as a writer and then theater owner in this, he makes his fortune by investing in real estate and doing all these things, and is able eventually to leave London just a few years before his death in the 1618. So just a really quick hit on Shakespeare, kind of fascinating guy in his own right, and we know very little about him. Okay, so just as we're moving towards the end here, I want you to see, this is an actual image of what they've recreated of Shakespeare's theater, the Globe. You can see it's round shape. It is open air. You can see the sunlight pouring in there. On some things I want you to know about this. There were no lights, so all performances were daytime. You can see the stage is actually really pretty simple. They would not have had a lot of props. It was all about costumes, though, and the performers themselves. And then if you look down in front where those people are standing doing this tour here, those were kind of like the cheap seats. That was standing room only. And folks would get in, and it would get pretty rowdy. There were like food vendors like moving through, selling beer. There were probably like nutshells on the floor, like meat on a stick, those sorts of things. And those folks down front would get pretty rowdy. They were called the groundlings, or referred to that. But you can also see there were the more expensive seats up above. And wealthy people would be able to come, educated people would be able to come. So the important thing to know here is this, that Shakespeare's plays, they kind of had to work to all audiences. There are these folks who may be very poorly educated, who probably are drunk, maybe, sort of down in front, who are just kind of there for, for entertainment, for something to do, to socialize sort of with one another. And so, Shakespeare's kind of doing this highbrow, lowbrow thing. If it sounds like a dirty joke, if it sounds like a fart joke in Shakespeare, it definitely is. There's slapstick, right? You have this sort of really low comedy, but you've got this really sophisticated stuff going on as well. And that's how he worked both audiences. Some other really quick things I want you to know about Shakespearean theater. Keep this in mind as we're reading this and watching this, thinking about Romeo and Juliet. All parts were played by males. Women were not allowed on stage in Elizabethan times in this era. And so it's all dudes up there. So that's something else to keep in mind as well. Okay, to wrap this up, the last slide here. Look, I know, guys, this is going to be tough. I said this at the beginning. I'm saying again, reading Shakespeare is hard. So I put Greek over there. That expression, it's all Greek to me. I'm not sure. Very possible that it actually comes from Shakespeare as well. You got to be patient. You've got to be able to work with me on this. You're not going to understand all of it. There are tons of footnotes in the book. I'm not expecting you to read all of those. I'm asking you to reread, to be patient, to listen. Just try to get the gist of things. Think about the interactions with the characters and watch. I'm going to put those video clips up there. Okay, so that's it. That's our run through Shakespeare for really quickly there. There is an assignment. I'm going to ask you guys to complete some questions about this. I hope you guys were listening to this carefully, and we'll talk again soon.